Blessings to all. This is Lyle Scott with the Association of the Yahweh's Faith Originally Delivered. This is the place where we discuss about Yahweh and the worship of Yahweh. Um, and we've been talking about the Christian Bible. And we talked about the patriarchs and how the patriarchs did not know who Yahweh was. We read Exodus chapter 6, verses 2 to 4, where Moses or Yahweh speaks to Moses and tells Moses that the patriarchs did not know the name of Yahweh. We also established that the patriarchs were from Mesopotamia, where they worshiped a god named El, and that El and Yahweh originally were not the same deity. We talked about Jacob versus Israel and how Jacob and Israel were originally not two different people. They were the same. I'm sorry, they were not the same people. They were two different people. And so one of the biggest stories concerning Jacob is that Jacob had a son. His name was Joseph, and Joseph, it basically means may he add, but Joseph he became second to Pharaoh. Okay, this is significant because there was a Pharaoh who had a Hebrew as his second in command. I forget his name though. I didn't think about researching that because I wasn't going to mention that in the video originally. So the children of Jacob become what is known as the Hyksos. The Hyksos, they come into Egypt. There's a speak of a conquest that happened, that the Hyksos came in. They didn't conquer. They came in gradually. I trust the biblical narrative of Jacob when it talks about or Joseph when it talks about the famine, the great famine, that Pharaoh had a dream that there was going to be 7 years of prosperity and 7 years of famine. And then the famine came to happen. And so in the book of Genesis, it says that the famine was so sore that nobody had food anywhere. So they had to go to places where where there was food. And Egypt had food because of Joseph. And so one of the other things about Joseph is the same person, I think is Ibmotep of Egypt. He also helped establish writing, the hieroglyphics, the ancient Hebrew writings, not the Hebrew writings, but the ancient Hebrew alphabet. And so he is very important. But from Jacob comes the Hyksos. So what we know about the Hyksos is that the Hyksos worshipped a deity called Hadad. They didn't worship El, and they did not worship Yahweh. They worshipped a separate deity called Hadad or Baal Hadad. So when you see Baal in the scriptures, Baal Hadad is what it's referring to. So Jacob worshipped a deity called Baal Hadad. The Hyksos worshipped Baal Hadad. So the Hyksos, they came into Egypt, and eventually they became the ruling class. They ruled for 100 years. I believe the year is 1650 BC is when they started, or 1645 BC is when they started. And then the last king reigned in 1550. Now, this last king named Kamadi, this is the Exodus. Uh, Let me rewind. So, the Hyksos, they were a Canaanite people. They migrated into Egypt and they eventually became the ruling class. When they became the ruling class, they only worshiped one God. And so the God that they worshiped was Bel Hadad. And it was similar, or it was equivalent to the Egyptian god Set. And so the Egyptians became upset because Seth was being worshipped, but all the other gods were being neglected. So you can imagine how that goes. We already talked about priesthood and how priesthood works. So imagine, I'm a priest, and I'm accustomed to people bringing me their sacrifices and giving me the land that they want to dedicate to their deity, and then all of a sudden it stops. So that means I don't have any more new land, and I don't have any free food, and so now, what do I do? You know, I want. I'm accustomed to getting money and to getting riches and to getting all of these things. What will I do? Um, so the Egyptian priests band together and got the people to band together so that they could kick the Hyksos out, um, so that they can get the worship to their gods going again. And so when they finally did that, there was a pharaoh called Am. I'm sorry, Moses. Moses. So blessings to everyone who's watching. I don't know who you are. So leave a comment, and if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comment section. So the pharaoh that chased out the last Hykso king and the Hyksos was Moses. Notice the name Moses in the name, Moses. So Moses kicked the people out, and he kicked out the king, and so this is the first Exodus. Now, the reason why I bring this up, and I think this is so important, is because biblical scholars, are trying to find when the Exodus took place. Um, the problem is that most scholars have at least two possible dates for the Exodus, and they vary. But this is me. I believe that there were two Exoduses. The first Exodus is the expulsion of the Hyksos. Now, the expulsion of remember the Hyksos were a Semitic people. And the reason why I think that this is significant is because around the time the Hyksos came out of Egypt, the some of the kings of the city states in Canaan began to send letters to the Egyptians asking for help, because there was a people that they called the Habaru, who were the same thing as the Hyksos. They were Semitic people that were attacking and taking their cities, exactly like the book of Joshua. Exactly like the book of Joshua. Okay, so that is historically speaking, that is the only big Exodus. It's the only evidence of an Exodus. Okay, unfortunately, it's not the time of Moses. And so Moses comes much later in the story. So if Moses wasn't in the Exodus, then what is all of this about? And so we're going to get to the second Exodus, but let me focus on the first Exodus. So the first Exodus would have happened in 1550 BC. 1550 BC, okay? And it was the Hyksos that were coming out of Egypt. It's the only mass mass exodus that's historically attested, okay? That's the first one. So, uh, the people or the majority of the Canaanite. I want to say Canaanite. The reason why is because there is heavy evidence that the Israelites were formerly Canaanites. Okay, and so the Canaanites and the Israelites would have all been in the same Exodus. So this is the deal. Remember that the Canaanites are not actually a people. They are a mix of tribes that are in a geographical location, which is called Canaan. Okay. So the Canaanites are not a people, they are a mix of tribes. Among that mix of tribes were the tribes of Israel. Now, the tribes of Israel originally may not have been a whole nation. Israel may be a nation of, of tribes who decided to make a strong alliance or who had certain things in common. So they made an alliance to, a brotherhood. And so naturally from that comes the legend of a man named Israel. There probably was no man named Israel. Okay. It was probably just,
made up story.
Yeah, most likely it's a made up story. And so, or maybe Abram is the only patriarch because there's nothing really written about Isaac. But of course, when it comes to these stories, because you're talking about a person and then you're talking about a nation, you have to be able to explain where the nation's name comes from. And that's the purpose of the story. So of course there has to be a genealogy connected to the story. Let's be honest here. So, it was very common in those times for varying tribes to make alliances and to form nations like that. When you read in the book of Judges, though, in the book of Judges, the tribes are all to themselves. The tribes get attacked and they have to defend themselves. You see that a lot in the book of Judges. But so there's the book of Joshua that does happen in that time. But here's something interesting. The name Joshua means the Lord or Yahweh saves or will save. Okay. It's evident in Numbers chapter 13. I forget the verse, but let me look for it now. Numbers chapter 13. Numbers chapter 13. And verse. I'm on the wrong page. Numbers chapter 13. Yeah. And verse 16. It says, "These are the names of the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land." Numbers chapter 13 and verse 16. Oh, okay. These are the names of the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land. And Moses called Hoshea, the son of Nun, Joshua. So it was Moses who changed Joshua's name. Joshua may have been a totally different person because Moses is from a different time. One of the things that you'll notice about the Bible is that there is a lot of repetition. There are a lot of repeated stories, and it gets even worse when you get in the New Testament. There are repeated names. These repeated names were made specifically to confuse. I don't mean to down the word of God, like most people are gonna say. You're doubting the word of God. The word of God has no mistakes. No comment. So Moses changed Joshua's name. There are a lot of people whose names are changed. It doesn't mean that what that means is that Joshua and Hosea are two different people. That the authors or the person that redacted, the redactor is the person that combined the stories. The redactor wants Joshua and Hosea to be the same person. Okay. Originally, they may not have been the same person, but the names are similar. Hey, Jacob and Israel. The redactor wants that to be the same person. Okay. And so they're combining things, and that's a pattern that we have to see. They're combining things. If you notice, though, when you're reading the Bible, especially in the first 5 books of the Bible and the Jewish scriptures, you'll see that there were 12 tribes of Israel, and it started off with 12 brothers, right? And among those 12 brothers is a brother named Levi. But when the Exodus takes place, Levi has no inheritance. How is that? Levi has no inheritance, and Joseph takes up 2 tribes. Why couldn't you just let Joseph be one tribe and give Levi an inheritance? No. So you see that something is wrong here. The Bible is telling us that the Levites did not have land. The reason why they did not have land is because they were not in the Exodus, in the first Exodus. They came out in a second Exodus where Moses was involved. Okay, so this Exodus took place in 1446 BC. Okay, and Moses, what we know as Moses, there were a few people in Egypt called Moses, but they had like something in the beginning, like Moses or Third Moses. So there was a pharaoh called Third Moses that describes Moses's mother perfectly. Moses' mother finds Moses drifting in the river, and she picks him up. She takes him for herself. And the co-regent of Third Moses II is the mother of Moses. She was a co-regent, mind you, meaning that she was a queen who was reigning beside the king, the pharaoh. Okay, so this is Third Moses. Now, with this thing, this was a smaller Exodus, about 6,000 people. But if you're looking in the book of Numbers, the Levites numbered to hundreds and thousands, right? But if you look in the Hebrew, you can easily see how the numbers are mistranslated and exaggerated. Okay, so they make 1,000 into 100,000. It's fairly easy. And so it wasn't 600,000 people that came out of that were led by Moses. It was about 6,000. It was a small tribe, and it was his tribe. It was the nation or the tribe that he came from. He led them out of Egypt. Now, so this is the deal with Moses. We're talking about the second Exodus now. I'm trying to remember. Did I remember everything about the first Exodus? Are there any questions about the first Exodus before I go to explain the second one? Did you have a question, BB?
So Joshua's story is not based on the first Exodus?
It is based on the first Exodus, but his name couldn't have been Joshua because they didn't know Yahweh. They didn't know Yahweh at all. So it's 2 different people.
Israel is just a country.
Say it again.
Israel is not a person, it's a country.
Israel is probably just the name of the allied tribes, of an alliance of tribes. It may not have been an actual person, but they wanted to explain where the name came from. So they took a story of a man and or they took a name of a man and put a story with him.
But that story of that man doesn't matter. Because it was just added on.
Yeah,
So Jacob
Jacob is different.
timeline.
So Jacob, we don't even know when Jacob existed. We have no idea because it's totally unrelated to Israel. But
It was two Jacobs.
no, there was one Jacob in Israel.
Okay.
So
But they weren't at the same timeline because that whoever that man drew name Israel,
mhm,
that they made that story.
right. So whoever he is, we don't even know when he existed. But Jacob had to exist around the time of there is a documented famine concerning Egypt. You know, there was a flood, or not a flood. There was a famine, and a lot of people came to Egypt. There was food in Egypt. There's in the Middle East. There is documented to be a great famine. So Jacob would have lived around that time, and he would have migrated from the Middle East into Egypt around that time. But Israel, we don't really know what his timeline is. So that's basically the summary of the first Exodus. I'm going to go into the second Exodus now. So the second Exodus has to do with Moses. And Exodus chapter 1 basically deals with, for instance, it says that there was a Pharaoh that didn't know who Joseph was. And so that Pharaoh began to oppress. And this is documented. This is documented that the Israelites were oppressed in this way and that they were killed in that way. The males were drowned in the river and the females were left alive. So that was documented. It's documented that the co-regent of Pharaoh third Moses II didn't. I'm not sure she had a child of her own, but she did adopt a child. Okay, there is speculation that he was Hebrew, and so this is where the story of Moses begins. The story of Moses begins with Moses being a prince, remember he had a princely many people, unless the Bible says that he was very educated, we don't put two and two together. If he was a prince, he was very well educated. Very well educated, okay? So it would have been easy, yes, for him to write documents and to write the laws. It would have been easy for him, okay? But this Moses goes into Midian. In Midian, he marries a Kenite, where he learns about Yahweh. He must have been there for some years. We don't know how many years. And just so you know, whenever the Bible gives a number age, they live to be 120. They might be exaggerating, just maybe. Again, when it comes to numbers can very easily be manipulated. The translation of numbers can be manipulated. I was about to make a comment, but I'm gonna skip it. So Moses marries a Kenite, and when he marries a Kenite, he learns of Yahweh from the Kenites. Okay, with the knowledge that he has of Yahweh, he goes back to Egypt and he liberates his people, his tribe. Okay. And so the Levites may not have been purebred Hebrews. They may have been a mix of Egyptian. The names seem to suggest that there was a mixture going on. Amram is an Egyptian name. Moses is an Egyptian name. Aaron is an Egyptian name. Okay. But Miriam is not an Egyptian name. So some of the names of the people who came out, like Gadi, that's an Egyptian name. Okay. So we have to understand these things, that a lot of the people who were coming out, first of all, they were Moses' tribe. They were Moses' people. Moses had something in common with them, if not a common heritage, okay, a common ancestry. He led his tribe out. He led them through the wilderness. And, there's a song in Spanish, Por el día columna de nube, por la noche de columna de fuego. So that Moses was led by a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud. Brothers and sisters, that's a volcano. Moses was led out by a volcano. The plagues may have been an introduction to a volcanic eruption. Okay? Think about it. They're at the mountain, thunders, lightnings, and shaking. That could have very well been a volcano or a thunderstorm. It was a volcano. The pillar of cloud, that's a volcano eruption. Okay, so I'm going to give you a hint. I'm going to. A lot of people have been asking me about, who is who is Yahweh, and who is El. I do want to do separate studies of them. That's going to take me a lot more research, because that information is all over the place. But I will do it. I will do a study on who Yahweh is, or better yet, who is the Yahweh that the Kenites worship. Because we all know from the Bible, well, not really, we don't really know, but the name Yahweh is starting to become very popular now. And so, there are sects of Christians who are, using the name of Yahweh and all these things. And so we do want to do a study, because as we will do you will find out in a later study that I'm going to do, the deity of Yahweh and the deity of El and the deity of Baal Hadad, were combined at a later date. Okay, so the attributes of El were added to Yahweh, and Yahweh's name was stricken from the record, so to speak, or his name was silenced. And so we're going to talk about all of that later. But Moses brings the people of Israel to Mount Sinai. And if you are familiar with Mount Sinai is a volcano. So, in the Bible, in Exodus chapter 19, it says that the whole mountain was on fire because Yahweh was on the mountain. That's one way to put it. Or there was a volcanic eruption. That's why there was fire in the mountain. Okay. So how did they stand in this volcanic eruption and not die? Well, if you look at Exodus chapter 19, you'll see that Yahweh supposedly commanded Moses to dig a trench so that the lava would not touch, could not touch them. Let me find that verse for you. Exodus 19. Exodus 19 and chapter 23. Exodus 19 and chapter 23. It says, but Moses said to Yahweh, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us. I'm sorry, I skipped too far ahead. It's chapter 19. Where is that verse at? Well, Yahweh tells them to tells Moses to make a fence. But and I'm sorry, I can't find it right now. But Yahweh tells Moses to make a fence, quote unquote fence.
What was it, 12?
Oh, okay, there it is. Yep, verse 12. You shall set bounds for the people all around, saying, take heed to yourselves that you do not go up to the mountain or touch its base. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. Well, no wonder they'll be put to death, because they're going to get burned up by lava. Okay? So Yahweh tells Moses to put a fence around the people. Okay? That fence, can you imagine him putting up a fence? It would have had to been a trench so that the lava could go in, or there had been holes in the mountain so that the lava could go in. Otherwise, the people would have been burned up. And so Moses, unfortunately, doesn't give the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments is a later, comes from a later source than the Yahweh's. The Yahweh's source is said to be written around 850 BC. The Ten Commandments doesn't come until at least, I would say, 700 BC. Excuse me.
Makes sense.
And people have already started to notice, though, that the Ten Commandments come from the laws of Ma'at, which is Ma'at was an Egyptian god.
Yeah.
It's too close. It's too close. And so we can see that one of the sources had connections to Egyptian sources, okay? Or they had relations with Egyptian priests or Egyptian religions, because the laws of Ma'at, they're very extensive. And for anybody to look in there and take some out and say, hey, this is what the Lord said through Moses, they had to have some extensive education concerning it.
Same thing with the Torah. Why would Yahweh tell you the whole Torah, the whole 260 something laws?
613 laws.
Oh, there you go.
That's a lot of laws. And then when you're looking at Exodus 21 to Exodus 23, those correlate to the laws of Hammurabi. The laws of Hammurabi were much earlier than that. Much earlier. Okay? So the laws of Hammurabi, and I've read the laws of Hammurabi, and I'm like, wow, it's an exact parallel. It's too similar. It's too similar. So the person who wrote Exodus 21 to 23 and the beginning of the introduction to Deuteronomy had extensive knowledge on the laws of Hammurabi. You can tell that it's only the introduction and possibly the conclusion. Okay, so what's in the middle, those are laws that were made through time, which we're going to explain that later. The Torah of Moses, the Torah. Let me think. So Moses leads them to Mount Sinai with a volcano eruption. That's how he leads them to Mount Sinai. Okay. And he goes, he leads the Levites into the land. Now, I don't believe that the Levites came in. There is a possibility that the Levites came in with war. There is a possibility of that. But the Kenites usually did not come to a place where they were at war. They would usually come through trade. So I can see the Levites coming in through trade because the Kenites were with them. The Kenites were nomads, so they know how to get into nations and to get out. And so now, when did this Exodus take place? There's in the book of Judges a clue of when it took place. If you go to Judges chapter 5, which is the Song of Deborah, Judges chapter 5. Now I'm going to read from verses 1 to verse 6. Okay? It says, Then Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, sang on that day, saying, When leaders lead in Israel, when the people willingly offer themselves, bless Yahweh. Hear, O kings, give ear, O princes. Even I, will sing to Yahweh. Now, that in itself says a lot. Even I, will sing to Yahweh. This tells us that she was not a prophetess of Yahweh. She was a prophetess of another deity. But she's saying here, I'm going to sing to Yahweh right now. Because Yahweh was the one who delivered them in this instance, okay? Just a little context. The children of Israel were being oppressed by, I believe, the king of Canaan. And is it the king of Canaan? Yeah, the king of Canaan. And so the person who killed the king's commander, who had the fiercest army, was a Kenite. And Judges chapter 4 explicitly says that, let me find the verse. Heber, where are you at, Heber? Verse 11, Judges chapter 4, verse 11. It says, Now Heber, the Kenite of the children of Hobab, remember we said who Hobab is, the father-in-law of Moses, had separated himself from the Kenites and pitched his tent near the tamarisk tree of Zanam, which is beside Kadesh. So this Heber has a wife named Jael. This Jael kills the commander of the Canaanite king. Now, remember that the Kenites are Yahweh worshipers. So Deborah says in Judges chapter 5, even I, will sing to Yahweh. I will sing praise to Yahweh. Yahweh, verse 4, when you went out of Seir. Does anybody know where Seir is? Seir is in Edom. So there's something being said here. Yahweh, when you went out of Seir, when you marched from the field of Edom, this is not an isolated event, okay? This is not the first time that that there is references of Yahweh coming from Edom. Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 33 and verse 2. It says Yahweh came from Sinai, which is in Midian, Saudi Arabia, and dawned on them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran, which is also in Edom. And he came with 10,000s of saints. He came with how many saints? 10,000. 10,000 saints. From his right hand came a fiery law for who? For them. Okay. So Moses did give a law. Okay. So, let's see. Let's go to Habakkuk. My favorite song, Su gloria cubrió los cielos. His glory filled the heavens, and the earth is full of his praises. Habakkuk. Habakkuk. And that will be chapter. It's not chapter 3, is it?
Is Habakkuk a Hebrew name?
That I don't know. I haven't looked into it, but I sure will. Yes. Habakkuk, however you pronounce it. Chapter 3, verse 1. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shegonia. I don't know how to pronounce that word. Some of these words are difficult. Yahweh, I have heard your speech and was afraid. O Yahweh, revive your work in the midst of the years. I've been looking for that verse. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran, Selah. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. He had rays flashing from his hand, and there his power was hidden. Talking about in Edom. His power was hidden in Edom, not in Israel, in Edom. Before him went pestilence, and fever followed at his feet. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and startled the nations, and the everlasting mountains were scattered. The perpetual hills bowed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents in Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian trembled. So now look at this. It's talking about Yahweh being in Teman, in Edom. Edom is modern day Jordan, and being in Midian. Midian is northern Saudi Arabia. Okay? So this is not the only source where they're talking about Yahweh coming out of Edom and coming out of Midian. But of course, this information is hidden because we do not want, talking about the redactor of the scripture, the redactor of the Jewish Bible does not want us to think that Yahweh can be disconnected from Israel, because if Yahweh is connected to Israel, then that means anybody who thinks about worshiping Yahweh will think about Israel. So all of these sects of Christianity, messianic sects, that are, they're talking about Israel. Everything is about Israel. And they don't believe that the worship of Yahweh can be disconnected from Israel. But the Bible shows you that at once, the Bible and history shows you, if you look at the right verses, that the worship of Yahweh was disconnected from the Israelites. Okay? So we're going back to Judges chapter 5. And we're starting back at verse 4. It says, Yahweh, when you went out of Seir, when you marched from the field of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens poured. The clouds also poured water. The mountains gushed before Yahweh, this Sinai before Yahweh. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were deserted, and the travelers walked along the byways. Who are the travelers? These are the people that Moses led out of the land of Egypt. Okay, so in the time before, in the days of Shamgar, who was a judge in Israel, the Levites came and they started to settle in the land. You don't hear anything. What's interesting is Shamgar is mentioned in Judges chapter 3 and verse 31. It says, after him, speaking of Ehud, was Shamgar, the son of Anath, who killed 600 men of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also delivered Israel. think about this, okay? Think about this carefully. There's no war registered during his time. The only war is talking about the Philistines. Philistines means foreigners, okay? So there are two possibilities here. Either the Levites came in a peaceful manner and they settled in a few cities, in trade cities, or the Levites and the Philistines are the same, okay? And you got to think about this because in the book of Samuel, there's war with the Philistines. And the Philistines, have a different God. But they call him Dagon. Okay? So, But the Kenites were not known as a warlike nomadic tribe. And so, but there's a possibility that the Levites were known as a warlike nomadic tribe. That needs a little bit of research, I'll admit. You guys know. If you've been watching this long enough, you'll know that I'll let you know if I know something and if I don't know. But so in the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath, the Levites came in. How they came in, with violence or with peace, is not made evident here, okay? But they did have cities that they settled in. And these cities are named in the book of Joshua. Why? Because they wanted to merge the two exoduses and because later the Levites became a part of that alliance, but they did not have cities of their, they did not have a land of their own. You notice that the Levites, even in the Torah, are destined to be scattered among the tribes. Why are they scattered? Why are they scattered? Okay, because they came later. Any questions? So those are the two exoduses. The first exodus is the Hyksos, which is a large-scale exodus. It wasn't really an exodus, it was more of an expulsion. The Egyptians kicked them out. But the Levites, that was an exodus, and it was more small scale. Okay? And so it looks like that will be the end of our segment. If you have any questions, then let us know. If not, then just come by and say hi, you all be blessed. Until the next segment.